What does it mean to put humans, not technology, at the center of AI? So, Tiankai, let's get right into it.
We look at our screens a lot of times, and now in the times of AI, it feels like we are delegating and using a lot of stuff with AI that we cannot even do it without anymore.
Welcome back to the Analyst Architect and to our episode 2 of our Humanizing AI Strategy series with Tiankai Feng. Today we are diving directly into the heart of the book, the meaning of human-centric AI. This is where the entire conversation begins, because before we talk about competence, operating models, or conscience, we need to understand one thing. What does it mean to put humans, not technology, at the center of AI? So, Tiankai, let's get right into it. In your book, Humanizing AI Strategy, this opens with this bold question. Are we still humans? It's such a powerful way to start. What led you to open the book with this way, and what are you trying to make people reflect on?
Absolutely. I think it's an interesting one because it is actually me thinking out loud, right? When I started writing that book, I actually asked myself, are we even still humans? And the reason why I'm asking that simple question is because the first reaction, of course, is a yes, right? Any human reader would read it and say, okay, of course I am. And then basically we think about how we spend our time in our day-to-day, and we look at our screens a lot of times. And now in the times of AI, it feels like we are delegating and using a lot of stuff with AI that we cannot even do it without anymore, right? It feels like we're getting more and more dependent on technology. And if we are dependent on technology, are we actually still humans or are we not? And in a way, it's an interesting one because while my question is asked deliberately in a provocative way, it also can be framed in a more positive way where people call it about the augmented human, right? Like having AI capabilities paired with human expertise and human thinking makes people more augmented. And I kind of want to initiate that thinking a little bit, right? Augmenting means we are still ourselves and we have not lost any part of us, but we become more, right? But we shouldn't then let AI take over stuff from us, so we become less and AI is just a more part of us. So where do we find that balance? And I think with that question, I'm trying to open exactly that conversation.
That's a fascinating perspective, Tiankai, and it sets the tone perfectly. You are essentially asking organizations to pause and rethink the way they approach AI, and not just organizations, even professionals.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
not technical projects, but as a human responsibility.
Exactly.
Well, how do you define human-centric AI, and what are the biggest misconceptions about it?
Yeah, I think human-centric AI really in the most simple way is, in my point of view, AI that's inherently helping people, right? It's inherently actually for the greater good of humanity, then that is human-centric. And I think the misconceptions of it is that it doesn't mean that we should put more human beings into AI projects, right? It's not about having humans as dependencies of AI. And it also doesn't mean that we should just focus on human beings and AI together, having to do everything together. It's more about deciding on the why of AI rather than the what and the how. And for me, it also means that if we don't think about how it's helping people, right, then what are we even doing it for? Right? Because if it's not supposed to help people, for some way it might help some other things, but isn't the ultimate goal that we should do something right for society? So that is the bigger question that I think a lot of companies should probably ask themselves. There's also the other scenario of it, which is that human-centric means to center around all of the human beings that are involved, right? And it's not only, for example, to exaggerate about treating only the shareholders as human beings to make them happy and lay off 1,000 people, right? It's not selective to be human-centric, right? If you're human-centric, then you have to
100%.
center around all of the human beings. So making a smaller group of people happy by hurting the other group of people isn't really human-centric. And that's, I think, one of the other misconceptions that we need to think about.
I love that, Tiankai, and I like how you emphasized that human-centric AI is not a checkbox, or it's not related to a specific group of people over others. It's more into a mindset, and even more, it's a lens through which all decisions should be made.
Absolutely.
Yeah, 100%. Now, let's make this a little bit more practical. You talk a lot about moving from vision to behavior. And I think people really struggle with that translation. So if we can imagine an organization that truly embodies a human-centric approach, what does that actually look like in daily practice?
Yeah.
From your perspective?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I do think that when we talk about human-centric organizations, it immediately has a flavor of culture, right? Company culture and how your mindset and your skill set and your behavior is an organization by default. And a lot of things actually is about, are we putting employees and customers in the center of what we do or not? And are we actually listening to their needs and making them happy as we want to be? And we can use maybe some of the needs that I would think of. So for example, if people actually do want to climb up the career ladder and they want to grow in a certain way, is the company and the organization providing upskilling material, academies, maybe even certifications, maybe? Is it sponsoring certain ways of taking courses? And is it allowing career paths that might be a little bit non-linear, right? Is it allowing people to jump between different departments and allow them to grow to actually be there? That is a very concrete way of looking at if they're actually human-centric or rather just task-centric, for example. Right. Another thing to it, I think, is about, let's say, collaboration, right? And how siloed the organization is, right? Or if actually cross-functional collaboration is by default something that's happening, right? And you would see that on the behavior of people, right? If they rather not share any information and everyone keeps their own little repository information to themselves, or is everyone by default having a network of people they like to talk to and work with to actually make things happen cross-functionally. And on that note, maybe one third example would be the topic of innovation and experimentation, right? Where what about failure culture, right? So if we want to innovate, we need to experiment, and not all experiments work out, right? Sometimes things don't work out. And often in companies that don't have a great culture, right, they would punish people for having done something wrong, right? Because why did we do that if it didn't work out? But if we truly mean it and we want people to grow and we want to be human-centric and we want to help with their curiosity, we need to let them fail too, right? The stakes might be lower and we don't let them fail very expensively, but we should let them fail, and we should not actually punish them for it, but we should actually maybe even reward them for having tried something new and having then found their path maybe towards a working function. But those are things that I think are really important and are great indicators if an organization is human-centric.
I like how you grounded it in behaviors, not slogans. We always see we care about people
Yeah,
sentence written in all
exactly.
PowerPoints and all the strategies, but it's about how teams collaborate, like you mentioned, how leaders, the blaming culture, how they
Exactly.
deal with the blaming culture. I think this is very, very good perspective. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I would say that this brings us to something I find incredibly important, which is the purpose. Because when AI loses its connection to human purpose, you end up with projects that are technically impressive but practically meaningless.
Mm-hmm.
So, can you share an example or maybe from your work or from the industry that you would like to share where reconnecting AI to human purpose made a real tangible difference?
Absolutely. I do think that the most important examples for this would be rooted in what has been driving humanity and society for a long time, which could be, for example, in medicine research, right? And specifically cancer research, right? And we immediately think about AI for good. But what happens in cancer research driven by AI is a lot about having to go through a lot of data, right, of trials and of different kind of tests. And it's impossible for human beings to do it all on their own, right? And having to go through all those data sets and actually have to identify patterns. And this is where combining AI with it and have a smart assistant almost that helps you go through all the data and making first assumptions or first hypotheses about it, to not have a human being having to do it all manually, is very, very important, right? It accelerates research around cancer. It still keeps the human being in the driver's seat. And by the end of it, you actually create something really great, which is a cure for cancer, which is, of course, really important for the world, right? And that is something that I always think about when I need to have a good example about why not everything around AI is bad. This is something that I would like to bring up as something where AI actually makes a lot of sense. Maybe to answer your question from a different way, where it's the opposite of it, is what I see very often companies do by putting AI and generative AI into contact centers and customer service, right? So what happens is they think that they don't want to engage a lot of people as employees anymore in the contact centers and having them in call centers anymore or doing live chats. They lay off all these people and replace it by a chatbot, right? And that chatbot, first and foremost, is of course very generic and not behaving exactly like a human being, which then also means that not only are the people that laid off very unhappy that they were replaced by a machine, but the customers that now have to deal with actually a chatbot instead of talking to a human being, which would be much faster, also are unhappy. So you made both sides of the equation unhappy in the end, right? So the customers are less happy, the employees are not less happy. And by the end of it, when people are really dissatisfied with the contact center, then even shareholders are not happy because it didn't actually lead to growth. So this is, I think, a typical case where you have not actually related it to human purpose. It was a short-term choice to cut costs, right? And the cutting of the costs itself came with a much bigger cost, which is on the human side of it, which finally then in the end, of course, is biting you back.
Thanks for these two great examples. I love them. And I would say it shows exactly what happens when you treat AI as a tool for human empowerment rather than a machine that runs on its own.
Yeah, exactly.
It really proves your point. Well, let's close this episode by speaking directly to architects and strategists.
Yeah.
The people designing the future of organizations or solutions within organizations as well. They are constantly balancing between two forces, automation that drives efficiency and humanity that drives meaning. From your perspective, how can they navigate the tension or that tension in a healthy, sustainable way?
Absolutely. I think to that note, right, this brings us to the topic that we often talk about as human in the loop, right? Because if you want to really automate everything, then where in that loop is the human being, right? And how much and how little should we have human involvement if the goal is to automate? And to that note, I think it's a really good question, because the idea is, first, the question is, what should we automate? What are the right things to automate? And that itself already brings a big question, because the criteria for something to be automatable means that there are clear rules and clear requirements how a certain automation should act with a clear objective, right? Like, let's think about AI agents. But if the whole work of it is a lot of nuanced, and it's very much not having clear actions, and every time something new happens, someone has to behave differently, then this maybe is not a great example for an automation, but it should actually stay with the human beings. And if that now continues, right, and this is something where it makes sense to automate it, then the question is, how many things could go wrong and what could be the reasons for things to go wrong, right? Because that question defines how much human beings should be still in the loop. So you cannot let the machine be completely autonomous, but there should be some kind of involvement when that happens. In the book, I bring up the example of fraud detection, right? That when you are an e-commerce store and basically someone is trying to use like a fake credit card or something, for example, right? Or someone else's credit card, then you should have certain rules in place when a human being needs to be involved, right? It might be an agentic stuff with AI where the whole transaction is being done this way, but it should be then flagging things, right? Either the amount might be too high, or let's say the address doesn't really, the invoice address doesn't fit to the delivery address, for example, and something is really off, et cetera, et cetera. So when these criteria happen, they should be hard rules that whenever that happens, the process stops and a human being needs to get involved. So you have a trigger point that for two specific things, a human being always needs to get involved. And that is, I think, something that we should always think about, right? Except when, and those conditions of when actually we should stop the automation and let a human being jump in needs to be always clearly defined no matter what it is. Because in any case, there's always exceptions. There's never going to be anything where we don't expect anything to happen. We just need to be clear about what might not happen. So from a strategy and architecture point of view, I think strategists and architects are really good at looking at the bigger picture, and they're also really good usually at anticipating what might go wrong. So this is something I think that to just bring that critical thinking in and think about everything that is possible to go wrong and try to put them into as guardrails and trigger points into the automations to then make sure you have a balance between automation and human.
That's a very important message, Tiankai, and you are reminding us that the art is balancing between both humanity and automation, not being biased to a specific part of it. Yeah, thanks for that. And that brings us to the end of the episode 2. Today we explored what human-centric AI really means, not as a buzzword, but as a foundation for how organizations think, act, and design their future. Tiankai, would you like to add something at the closing thought before we close the session?
No, I think that this was a really great episode from my point of view, and we will dive even further more into it in the next episodes. So I look forward to people watching our next episodes too.
Thank you so much for unpacking this with such clarity. In the next episode, as Tiankai mentioned, we shift from a philosophy to capability a little bit, how professionals can build AI competence and being confident in the age of the rapid change. Thank you so much, Tiankai, for your time. Thank you, everyone watching us. See you in the next episode.